Welcome everybody. This is the last breakout session, I think, of the day. So hopefully everybody's still got at least a little bit of energy here to listen. My name is Peter McNally. I'm a data scientist at SmithGroup. Title of the presentation, as you can see, is From POC to Prod, Developing WordSmith, a RAG application to support marketing in the AEC industry. And today I'm really going to talk about kind of the journey of this individual application and explain a little bit what it was like developing our first generative AI application. I'm going to go into some details, might even get into the weeds a little bit, so hopefully everybody's comfortable with that. If you haven't heard of RAG, it's Retrieval Augmented Generation. I don't know, term's been around for the past 18 months or 2 years or so, and a lot of the things that we experienced, I think, would still be relevant to people that are developing it today. We might have done things a little differently, but in hindsight, we probably would have taken a very similar path, albeit maybe just generating or devoting more resources to this just a little bit sooner. And if you're not familiar whatsoever with the AEC industry, I'll get into that as well. Just a brief overview of what we're going to do. Real quick personal overview, then dive into what SmithGroup is. Going to level set some RAG basics if you're not familiar with that at all. I'm going to explain our marketing use case, why we went with that, and then demo the application itself. Then I'll kind of go back and explain that journey and how we got here, starting at the very early points, POC, even before that, and then what we're doing with our production environment. And then also talk about some of the things that we have in our development environment and some future directions, and hopefully there'll be time for questions as well. All right, before I jump in, I just thought I'd point out, so in the background of these different section slides, I'm going to have some professional photography showing some of the projects that we've done. Most of them are around the Detroit area. This one happens to be the Blueberg Center at Johns Hopkins University. So here's me. Have 2 degrees at the University of Michigan, undergrad math and philosophy, master's degree in urban planning. Did that right away. As far as my professional experience goes, I kind of have a mixture of private and public sector. Started with the city of Detroit as a city planner, did a few different things. Business intelligence with XPO Logistics when it was Conway Freight. I moved into data science, and I've been at SmithGroup for the past 8+ years, which is way longer than anything else there. So that kind of combines that planning background as well as the data science background. And then I work in our technology and practice group, which supports all of the offices that we have. So for this particular application, I definitely have to give a shout out to my teammates that worked on that. This is kind of we have a pretty lean team. These are the core people that worked on it. Carl on the infrastructure side with Azure. He has more permissions, more knowledge about that, so he's very helpful there. Then Chowdhury and Eric are both application developers. So they took kind of some simple code that I generated and got it up and running, development environment, production environment, continued to enhance it by adding features. Now SmithGroup, if you're not familiar with the architecture industry, you may not have heard of us, but SmithGroup has been around for, this is our 172nd year, so quite a history there. We are the oldest continually functioning architecture firm in the country. We have 20 offices around the country in these 4 regions. Philadelphia is our most recent location. We opened that earlier this year. We've got over 1,500 multidisciplinary staff members in these offices. It may not seem huge compared to other industries, especially in the Detroit area with the prevalence for manufacturing and auto, but this does make us one of the largest architecture firms in the country. And then we frequently produce award-winning work, AIA National Awards, Lab of the Year Awards, many other awards as well. So to give you an idea of kind of the breadth of the projects that we do, these are the 11 markets that we operate within. So everything from cultural to workplace and kind of all of these in between. And then in addition to architecture, we're considered what's called an integrated design firm. So we also do engineering, so civil engineering, mechanical engineering, electrical engineering, landscape architecture, planning, even down to site surveying, and many things like that. So that makes us part of what's called that AEC industry, or architecture, engineering, construction. And then again, if you're not familiar with that, it's pretty rare to see tracks that are industry tracks at data conferences that I attend. So could be a challenge, or you can also view it as an opportunity. I get to work with some really creative people that think a lot differently than I do, and it can be very energizing. And then the project I'm going to talk about today is definitely one of those things. So talking about RAG, before I jump into that, I'm curious how many people have used a RAG system that they know of? And anybody worked on actually developing or implementing one themselves? All right, great. So hopefully this will be educational for some and maybe interesting to hear about what the experience is for others that have done something similar. So diving into that acronym, RAG, it's really 3 different phases there, right? The retrieval, augmentation, and generation. And on the retrieval side, you're basically using vector search to find the most relevant documents. And then you pass that in the augmentation phase, gets that grounding content that's been retrieved, adds it to the user prompt, and then passes it into the LLM. And then in that generation phase, that LLM's producing a response based on your system prompt using that grounded content. And I heard people talking earlier about hallucinations. So that's one of the things that happens all the time, right, with LLM models if you're just using them, especially in the past, have gotten better. But RAG there's a couple different things within RAG that will help to mitigate that. And one of those is just like what I already talked about, right? So you're grounding it in the documents themselves that it's retrieving. Then in your system prompt, you can have instructions in there to say, hey, pay attention to this as the grounding content. Don't use anything else. If you don't know the answer, let the user know. You can also set different parameters like temperature. And when you do that, then the response that comes back is very strict. It's not very creative, and you'll get more consistent answers that way. And then finally, as I'll show, you can provide citations as well. So you'll know exactly what the content is that the LLM used to produce that response. This gets into it's kind of a high-level architecture of what WordSmith looks like and how you can think about RAG. So over there on the left side, we have our source documents. And for us, those are coming from SharePoint, Word documents, PDF documents. We have a set of logic apps that write those to blob storage on a trigger whenever there's any changes that happen. That gets executed. Then those go through an embedding model. Those get vectorized, stored in an index within Azure AI Search. Then looking over on the right side, you have a user interacting with an application. And then that user prompt also goes through that same embedding model. Goes to Azure AI Search. And then the similarity search occurs there, right? So then you grab a specific set of documents and you set a parameter there for how many that you might want, 5, 10 documents that are most relevant. It executes that search, passes that on to the LLM, GPT-4o in this case. It executes the system instruction, system prompt, responds to the user via the application, and you get a response that you might be familiar with. You know, this is just a chat interface, right? This is where maybe we get into a little bit of the weeds and everybody's like, all right, sounds good. What does that really look like? So I thought explaining at a simple level what an embedding model does might be helpful. So again, on the left side, that's like those left documents I showed in the previous slide. Those are the SharePoint documents, and those documents are really their document chunks. If they're too large, they kind of chunk them up. Pass it through an embedding model like OpenAI's A2 model, for example, and it converts each chunk of that text into a point in that case, 1,536 dimensional space, right? So every chunk of text is kind of consolidated to a single point, 1,500 entries in that one-dimensional array or that vector. And all of the documents go through that same process. Then similarly, that user prompt goes through that same embedding model, also gets vectorized, gets associated with that single point. So if you're like me and you think spatially, you know, our simple human minds can't think in 1,500 dimensional space. So this is kind of an abstraction of what that looks like in a very simple way. And you can think about those gray points as all of the documents that exist in that parameter space. And that red point there is the user prompt. And then that circle there say, okay, give me a K number of documents that are closest to that. So that happens, that similarity search happens there, is executed there within Azure AI Search. That gets passed to GPT-4o, goes through that system prompt and gets executed, and then that response is then what the user sees. All right, so now that we've got the RAG basics out of the way, why marketing? If you're not familiar with the AEC industry and the architecture, marketing is really how we get work. Typically, that goes the way of responding to a request for proposals. So a new project comes out, they list a set of requirements, they publish that, and then if you want to do that, you have to really execute quite a bit of work to produce a proposal to just be considered to do that work. And there's a process that goes through. And this is pretty detailed. There's a lot of phases and different roles involved, and just thinking about what I already showed about how SmithGroup operates. There's 20 offices across the country. There's 11 markets. There's all kinds of different disciplines. So there's content that is generated for all these projects, and it's spread out over a lot of different areas. There's often quick turnaround times with this. So sometimes we're talking a couple weeks, maybe even less than a couple weeks to try to respond to something that has just a ton of different requirements. And then data quality and stewardship. As everybody here knows, the quality of data is just tantamount to anything that we do. We were fortunate enough when we went through this process and started to develop WordSmith. Our marketing department had completely independently already gone through an audit of the content and archived stuff that was no longer relevant. So they had a SharePoint site that was set up in multiple folders. All the data is already there. So, and they continually refine that as well. This slide here goes through the process of what happens during an RFP pursuit. And this looks really simple, but this is actually like a 75 slide deck that this came from. So there's kickoff strategy, and then goes into the messaging and content development, and that's where WordSmith can come into play and really help them. There's several different review phases, and then finally that production and delivery phase. And again, that's putting out like a professional quality document that in and of itself looks like a product. So just to dive into that second phase there's 13 different topics or elements that go into that. And looking into that a little bit more into the project understanding phase, these couple of pages on the right here are some of the examples of what we might see in a proposal for an RFP pursuit. And to do this, you really have to focus on project knowledge, on product knowledge, or on project knowledge and client knowledge. You want to pull information that from other previous projects that you've done that are very similar. You want to demonstrate a capability and understanding, and that comes through in being authentic. You really can't fake it if you haven't done it before. And then in any case, if you can, any type of like visual content that will pull them in will really help out as well. And kind of continuing that, there's more examples of what it might look like and the different levels that you might operate at. You want an executive summary, you want some things that are thought leadership, any articles that you've produced in the past. That can always be great to include into that. And then I mentioned with SharePoint, like we'd recently undergone that audit, and that was really helpful. But even if you have all of this information on SharePoint, anybody who's ever used SharePoint search, sometimes it can be very difficult to find what you need, right? You have to have that exact keyword, or that exact folder to look at, and like you can just kind of pull your hair out and not being able to find the content that you want, and you may even know that it exists, right? Or new employees don't know that projects exist, and it becomes very hard for them to find that. So that's, again, where WordSmith's going to come in. It's going to help with the search, and then it's going to help with that generation, at least as a starting point for some content that you could put into an RFP. So here's what the landing page looks like, or the application page looks like for WordSmith. And the next slide, hopefully this demo will play. Then I'll take you through steps that wouldn't be something that a marketing department would do exactly because I did it, but I'll kind of walk you through what it might look like. So in the center is that WordSmith. We used an internal graphics person to generate that. Got a nice title bar along the top, and then you'll notice that I'm logged in using my SmithGroup domain. You can control that with Entra ID if you'd like. For example, if you're an Azure client, show instructions and then talk about the data and where that's coming from. So using that boilerplate marketing data and project stories from our external facing website. And then it has a couple sample prompts, which we really don't expect people would use, but maybe give them an idea of the types of questions they could ask, maybe format as bullets or maybe in one paragraph and describe our experience. So I have a query here that I put in, or a prompt. It's like, tell me about our net zero campus planning capabilities. So we do a lot of carbon net zero campus plans, for example, and like familiar chat interface. You see my user prompt and it starts to generate a response. It talks about a couple different projects here, U of I, University of Illinois, Climate Action Plan at Indiana University, some general information. And notice there's footnotes for that. Each one of those footnotes corresponds to a different document there, and there's the citations along the bottom. There's also some follow-up questions that it kind of detects looking at the information that you might want to ask. So first, let's jump into one of these citations, and it'll open on the right side within the application, and you can see what that looks like. So this is the document. It automatically scrolls down. It finds that IU, Climate Action Plan, and that content that's used, and scrolls the user down to that portion with the entire document rendered in there. And this is pointing back to that blob storage document, so it's not the source, it's a copy of the source. And then maybe I want to look at a different document, maybe more focused on energy. So I'll click another document, and that also renders. This one's a little shorter. And then, you know, it's got imagery, it's got a diagram, it's got some text which I can copy and paste here, or we just recently added some functionality, and you can actually open the source document in SharePoint. So you can't tell, but this is opening in a separate window. This is the actual source document. If I was on the marketing team, for example, I could come in here, I could edit this, I could save it, and then going back, that's going to kick off that logic app, that's going to make the change, that's going to cause it to be re-indexed, and so that the next time somebody comes into this, they're going to see this citation, and it's going to have whatever corrected version that would be. Also the supporting content, so this is actually the chunk of that document that it's using and what that looks like. This is what's getting vectorized directly. And then let's look at one of those follow-up questions. So more details on the climate action plan for Indiana University. So you can imagine that RFP process. Again, if we weren't going after a new project, you want to take that information, you want to include that in there, but you don't want to copy and paste it or do it yourself. So just give me some more information. If you don't want to look at the source document, you can use this as a starting point. And you know, the quality is okay enough, to at least good enough to get them started. And then, yeah, it's got that original source as well as it picking up another source from our web story that wasn't included above, so diving in a little deeper. In the upper right-hand corner, you'll notice that thumbs up, thumbs down. So if it looks good, great, give it a thumbs up maybe. Or actually, when I did this, I noticed there's this term PACT, or Performance Analytics and Climate Impact Team, and that's recently been changed to Impact. So I'm going to go ahead and give that a thumbs down here. And I'm going to mention, you know, the citation's wrong, the information's correct for the most part. It's not a fault of the application or a hallucination. So I'm going to go ahead and click Other. And then I'm going to type in, you know, this needs to be updated. Our PAC team is now called the Impact Team. So then once that completes there, and you hit that submit button, that's going to be written to the Cosmos DB database, and there's a container there that's storing all the conversation history. So then if we're monitoring that, we can go through and notice, okay, this needs to be changed, right? This is a lot better than email. This is direct feedback in the document. And looking at that again, this conversation history, again, all this is stored in Cosmos DB at the user level. If I want to delete something, since I've been searching for the same thing over and over, I can go ahead and delete that. That'll remove it from the Cosmos DB history and delete that. And basically, that's the way the application works. Go ahead and clear the chat, start all over, and your chat history will be available. So hopefully you can see how this would be a little better than just going to SharePoint and trying to search, right? It's going to bring you back documents. You can dive in a little more. You can generate some content. Okay, yeah, so talking to our marketing team, one of the things that we did is we surveyed them, and here are some of the responses that we got back. Again, our marketing team has been great to work with. They've been very engaged, and this just shows, I think, some of that. So, you know, they love this tool. It helps them find content quickly. Not only do they use it, they're sending others to use it. It's a great reference. It can save hours of research. And thinking about how that scales, if it's only 1 or 2 hours a week, if you scale it across your marketing team, it has dozens of people, and then maybe even more people that start to use that, you can really start to justify that ROI pretty quickly. And then finally, just somebody really loves like being able to see the source feature in SharePoint is great. So we continue to get this feedback and integrate features. And then finally, I mentioned that Cosmos DB piece. So we've started to point Power BI at it, and this is just a very simple example, but Cosmos DB can certainly be a data source for Power BI. And in this case, if you kind of squint, you see like a power law distribution maybe. Again, we just exposed this to our marketing team, so that's dozens of people, but there's been organic growth. Over 100 people at the firm have used it, so almost 10% at this point. And based on that feedback, we've seen some use cases that people are using it for things we didn't really intend, but they're finding benefit there. So we're going to have a push in the next month to integrate some other data sources and broaden the audience since the appeal seems to be there for this tool. All right, so now that you saw it, I'm going to kind of start to dive into the weeds and talk about how we got here. It was not a product management process. It was kind of starting out really simply with me back in August of 2023, watching some YouTube videos, doing searches on this stuff. And I'll talk to you about that a little bit. But shortly thereafter, Microsoft had a huge push, as everybody knows, with their OpenAI collaboration. So Azure AI Studio was launched at Ignite 23. We took advantage of that right away, started creating a lot of different Azure AI Studio applications. I'll show what that looks like. At this point, this still was not WordSmith by any stretch. It was just like, here's a couple applications. One was focused on marketing, one was focused on knowledge sharing. There were some other ones. But pretty quickly, we also started working with our marketing team. There was definitely some synergy there. They saw the value, they recognized the value. As I mentioned, they're great partners. So we started going through that process of developing a POC version. We started to encounter problems. We kind of pushed through those, got a development version out there, but we're still seeing some problems, and reached out to our Microsoft contacts and became part of the Azure Fast Track program. And that took a little bit. We had to go through a couple different engineers, but ultimately that helped align us. We still had to do all the coding, all the work ourselves, but they told us some best practices, and that kind of pushed us in the direction of where we needed to go. And also, I think importantly, told us what not to work on, things that don't make sense to work on, that are too much effort, maybe not enough value in return. So in August of 2024, we published our first production version, and then used a user survey to, and as I mentioned, get some feedback, and really continued to work both with focus groups as with that survey data to continue to add features to the application. So here's that first step. I don't know if anybody else has ever played around with this, but this was great to me. Really simple scripts using LangChain, ChromaDB, OpenAI API, and just vectorizing a simple thing here. I just looked at our employee manual and started asking it questions about PTO plans, and got into a little argumentative about it, but really, like any AI, it's not perfect, but really kind of for me provided that spark or that light bulb to really show that, this has a lot of promise. So then it was just about where does this make sense to really focus on and use within our business. And then the Azure AI Studio piece. So this has since been rebranded and relaunched as Azure Foundry, I think it's called, or AI Foundry. But even back here, over a year ago, the elements were still there along the left side. You can import your data, you can create indices, you can deploy models. There's this sandbox environment where you can play around with different models and parameters and even system prompts. And then for me, as a non-software developer, the part that I loved the most was that deploy. So you deploy that, and it's pretty simple to spin up an application, and that's what it looks like on the right? You point it to your data sources, you're able to launch this. This is where you can start to get into a POC phase really rapidly and start to iterate and see what makes sense. Deploy something to our marketing team, for example. And then behind the scenes, I didn't even know it at the time, but of course there's a GitHub repo that Microsoft's supporting that is the code for this. You can configure it kind of simply and redeploy it. Then, as I mentioned, some issues kind of quickly emerged, right? So this is the difference from getting up to a POC and then production, and that can be fairly large, right? Getting something up, showing functionality is a lot different than tailoring something to your particular users, your industry, and your firm. So we started running into some barriers, and here's just a few of them in terms of extracting text from images. As an architecture and design firm, imagery is huge for us. Ran into some issues there. The parameters like that we know exist. It's like, how do you actually set those? That was hard. What about other data sources? A one-time batch update or inserts one thing, but how do you update that information? How do you modify and customize that web UI? And then just general questions like, how is this really working behind the scenes? And here's a couple examples of those. So here's something that we might want to vectorize or ingest into as unstructured data, and this is a floor plan. And if you just want to take that text out, there's a lot of text fields on here. The ones that are circled are the ones that are recognized. And this is just, this is kind of the initial out-of-the-box functionality with extracting text via OCR, I believe, and their document intelligence that Microsoft's doing. It gets some of it, but you can see in this one, this keyed note for demolition is just completely mangling. And we spent maybe a little too much time on this before. This is one of the things working with Azure folks, Azure Fast Track in that program, that they told us what a solution could be and look like, and we played around there, but ultimately decided to table this one because it was just kind of too high effort. And we might come back to it, or hopefully somebody else figures it out, and we can just implement that. Similarly, that not being able to schedule things. It wasn't obvious, but apparently when you're setting up an index, there's a pipeline behind the scenes that's being set up in a completely different software environment called Azure Machine Learning Studio, if you're familiar with that at all. So that's where the pipeline was actually running, and the indexer was happening, index was being created. So we figured out eventually, okay, you can do that, you can modify the parameters there, you can set up a schedule and do that. But then even once we did that, we kind of found out the hard way that updates and deletes weren't working properly. So what we thought was updating and deleting, we found out was just an additive index. So it was only adding additional information. So going back to that scenario where the marketing team or somebody else has finds something and there's errors there, we modified that document, created a new version, the indexer ran, and then we were still getting references back for that old version, or in some cases we were getting references back for multiple versions. So this was another headache that really we didn't anticipate and didn't realize was happening. And again, so maybe the biggest thing that the Fast Track program taught us was, you know what, you need to get out of these studio tools. They're helpful to get something up and running, but you really need to move to the Azure portal. And that would allow us to address definitely that indexing issue. And I'll talk into that a little bit more details of that. And by this time, we're just compiling lists of things and just starting to go through these one by one and things that we were able to tackle and things that we kind of put to the side. So what does this look like in the Azure portal? This is going back to, I'm going to dive into a little bit here of Azure AI Search. That was that icon in the middle of that workflow that I displayed earlier. A couple of things to note on that left side. So there's indexes in there. That's where the data's stored, that vectorized content, along with any other fields that you may have. That indexer, that's what's scheduling the job. In our case, we're running that every hour. The data sources, it's blob storage and also some Azure SQL that we're using now as well. And then the skill sets, that's what's happening with the text splitting, the chunking. If you want to do that text extraction from images, that's happening there. Up along the top, Microsoft makes it pretty easy in the UI to do things all at once. So you can set these things up individually, these resources, or if you use that import and vectorize, it'll take you through a process to do this all and then populate all of those things. Just to show you what the first step of that looks like, connect to your data. So out of the box here is 6 data sources that are available. Again, upper left corner there, the Azure Blob Storage is primarily what we're using. We've also started using the Azure SQL database. So in addition to that marketing boilerplate content, we also have project level records that go back, I don't know, 10, 15 years whenever our data is still good. And there's narrative descriptions that are within several fields there. And those fields can be pretty long, thousands of characters, multiple pages in some case. So that's going to help us kind of broaden that audience by expanding that data set. One thing I will say here is that if you're really interested in this, that SQL endpoint for a Fabric Lakehouse does not exist as supported content. We're going all in on Fabric, so we're looking forward to that, hopeful that functionality coming soon. Then once you have all that done, you've gone through that import and vectorize, or you've done it manually, you've got an index there. And that index, that's what helps with that similarity search, right? So you can imagine this part, it's somewhat similar to the prompt that I had for the WordSmith demo, net zero carbon. So you do that in the Search Explorer tool that exists within your index, and you can see it's bringing back things in, like the University of Michigan Energy and Carbon Study. So these are the documents that are returned, the chunks of documents. And then Microsoft actually by default includes that 1536 dimensional vector. If you really want to dive into that and see what all those values are, that's provided there as well. So this is helpful when you do see a result and maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense or you're wondering why that content is returned. You can always just go back to this handy tool that exists. This was an interesting one, so this is also helpful when you get a result that, like I said, doesn't make any sense. So in this case, I was searching. I'll explain a little bit with our Azure SQL data source. The question there can be like, what type of content do you want to include there? And I mentioned the project narratives, but we've also got a lot of other information like the client name, the project name, the project manager, the city, the state, and things like that. So one way to do that is just to create a new field, create a view, and then just vectorize all that concatenated information in one. So that this is the result of what happened there, and it didn't really go very well. I was searching on a project manager's name and getting these odd responses back that didn't make a lot of sense and that she hadn't worked on. And then when I dove into it here, I realized she had a Hispanic last name. And it was returning back projects that had like Hispanic in the title. So a Hispanic theater, a Hispanic art center, and things like that. And you think about that in that abstract large space, you could see how if vectorizing a large chunk of text, and if you put it all together, it's got a last name that's Hispanic, it's got a Hispanic sounding project name, you could see how it would pull that. In another very similar case, we had another project manager, same data source, right? And her last name was Dakota. But he's bringing back projects from the University of South Dakota that we've done. She's not working on that at all, right? So again, going into this space, knowing nothing about it, you can try all kinds of things. And this was great feedback. And it makes, when you think about it, it makes sense that it comes back, but then you probably don't want to do that anyway. Include a project manager name. For that, you want a keyword search. You want a drop down. You want to be able to filter on it, sure, but it doesn't make sense. You don't want something that's similar to that project manager's name, right? You want that project manager's name. So we quickly got rid of that, and now we're just looking at like project descriptions and project names. All right, so I guess just the final part of the how we got here part and some of the takeaways. For me, as a data scientist, spending 15 years in analytics and data, this was just really different from anything else that I'd ever done before. It's not training and testing a machine learning model. It's not pointing at a single source of truth. There's like multiple different sources of truth, if you will, or descriptions. They're not even maybe. They have to be truthful, but there's narrative content there. It's not developing reporting for a KPI or data visualization, but what it definitely is a lot of infrastructure. In this case, I think this is either a dev or sandbox environment. I'm highlighted there if you can't read that. There's 25 different resources within this resource group. And when you start to think about having sandbox, dev, and prod environments, you have to set that up for each one. You have to understand this. Again, I did not spend a whole lot of time in Azure beforehand, but here are some of the resources that are important. Definitely those data connections. The Cosmos DB, storing it there, and for sure the search service as well. All right, just one more slide here about our current efforts and future directions. So there's a ton of things to do, right? And we still need to do them or want to do them. And part of that is like things that we just want to get done to make it more complete. In some ways, it's feedback that marketing or other people have said, you know what, we'd like to have this feature. I talked about recently integrating that SQL database for project descriptions. Just on that's kind of cool. You can have different databases or different data sets, that marketing data, a project data, separate indexers, but you can write to the same index if you want, right? So you have that same kind of descriptive content there, totally different data sources though, right? So that's definitely in our development environment right now, and we're actively putting that in prod this week actually. Text to SQL, that's a little different. I mean, some other people have talked about that as well. So text to SQL, that's another separate but related. You might use that same data source, but if you want, if right now, if you'd ask the WordSmith application to give you projects in Philadelphia, for example, it's going to go and it's going to get the ones that have the highest similarity scores, right, to that. It's going to put that into that LLM model and put that out. But what if you want all the projects that we've done in Philadelphia, right? That's a different thing. That's select star from projects or locations Philadelphia. That you can start to see, that makes more sense in an agent framework. which we're working towards. So instead of the RAG application in this sense, part of it becomes an agentic workflow. The text-to-SQL is an agentic workflow, and then at the top there's an agent there determining intent, pointing to which one of those workflows makes the most sense given what the user is asking. And then we're looking at LangGraphs, semantic kernel, and other frameworks to integrate that. This last kind of interesting one, so I mentioned our project web stories are one of the things that goes into our content. We're also looking at how to generate those web stories. So completely separate from RAG, you can just do some prompt engineering, say here are some of the text from some of these projects that we have on our website, and then it put that in the system prompt, say use the style and tone for these ones, and then also give it maybe a narrative framework of what you want that to look like, if you have a narrative arc or something like that. And then have a user prompt and say, here's when we have projects, we interview clients sometimes with, so there can be transcriptions or text or audio. There's articles that come out, there's PR releases, so all of that input, it can be put in by the user and say, generate a new web story for me based on this content. And we've tested that and looked at it side by side, said here's a web story that our staff created or a ghostwriter that we hired created, and here's one that AI created. And it can be really hard to differentiate those two, and depending on who you ask, you might, like which one's real, which one's fake, you'll get a totally different response. But then finally, just competing priorities will also affect additional feature deployment. So we want to do a lot of things, but we're constrained. We're a relatively narrow, lean team, and then we also want to start looking at things that are maybe more tied into the practice that we do, working with architects or engineers or other designers, and how to inject AI and ML into their workflows that are maybe more core to what they do and what we do as a business, as opposed to just into marketing. And then hopefully that'll, the architecture AEC industry has kind of been a laggard in terms of the digital transformation. But in the past 2 years, I think in part because of all the excitement from generative AI and not having to have structured data, being able to use textual data, being able to use imagery data with diffusion models and things like that, it's really been a real excitement from everybody at the firm and across the industry about this. So it's kind of igniting another level of excitement about data and producing data-driven work. And I think that's it. All right, so there's my contact information. If you want to reach out, feel free to. Any questions? I guess right in front, yeah.
Quick question for you. So you brought up the example of, so under the hood, all these like Gen AI models are essentially like probabilistic models. Like given a search string, what's the pattern or what's the expected result that most matches what the prompt was, right? So you're given something like Dakota, who was the name of an individual who was working on a project, but then in your prompt you ask for projects in like Dakota. Even though that individual Dakota didn't work, their projects might have been in like California or some other place other than Dakota, right? North Dakota,
Sure.
Dakota. I mean, how do you get around to, I guess, that overmatching?
Yeah, exactly. So like what I showed there was, I think one way to do that would to have a threshold for a search score, right? So it returned back the best results that it had. And that's probably because the best results it had weren't very good. So that was just definitely in a sandbox environment. It was like, let's see what comes back. We didn't set any threshold for how good that score needs to be. And at the same time, because we were using a SQL database, we were testing expanding the number to be like 20 as opposed to like 5 or something like that. Because typically thinking about that for like the proposal application, WordSmith, you don't need 20 projects, right? You want to talk about maybe the 5 best projects that closest match that. Yeah, maybe. I think maybe prompt engineering could work too, right? To say, like, pay attention to what's returned. If they're asking for a project manager, make sure that that's there, but in not like a location. But I really think it's because like I threw everything into that index, right? So a better way would probably to do, like I said, just make that field filterable or have multiple indexes and not just vectorize everything in one, right? So keep those things separate. If it doesn't make sense that they're all together, right? So descriptions, names, yeah, put that together, but project manager should be separate.
The same thing, couldn't that be considered, like Dakota, using that as an example, couldn't that be considered a kind of hallucination? No, we meant Dakota the person, not Dakota the place. I ran into something similar with different languages. Oh, this particular set of words is actually a different word in another language. This is back in 2018, so this is Stone Age for these kinds of tools. It was pretty early on. But I was tracking a particular pattern of speech in social media, specifically Twitter. And so there's this word that I pulled up, and it turned out that there's another word in Spanish, which is not the English word, but it just happens to have the same letters. It's just it's a homonym. It's a different word
sure.
completely. But in a different language, it means something else. Like for most people, just as an example, you spell the word J-E-S-U-S, you probably mean a historical religious figure. But in Spanish, it's probably your neighbor. It's a very common name in Spanish. So same letters, different language, different meaning. It's a kind of hallucination. And so wouldn't hallucination filters tend to grapple? The things you would do to stop hallucinations would catch that sort of thing too? No, we didn't mean Dakota the place, we meant Dakota the person.
Yeah, so I guess it depends maybe what you call a hallucination. To me, a hallucination would be more like it insisting on something, even though it was patently false. You demonstrated that it's false, and then it continues to say, no, it's really true. So just the result of similarity search, I don't see as a hallucination. It's just taking the closest thing. I think you also are talking too, though, about what an embedding model does. And I find that kind of fascinating as well. And I think there's not enough attention paid to embedding models and how to handle homonyms. Or if you were talking about something more industry specific in the jargon that we use in architecture, engineering, or any of you use in your fields, we're still using generic, like the 8-2 model or the large embedding models. Other models are generalized models for that embedding. But if you have very technical things, then maybe, and I haven't done this, just a thought, right? Would it make more sense to create your own embedding model or fine tune an embedding model that you could use that's particular to your industry? Yeah.
I have several, so I have to try to think of how much control do we have, or you have, during the RAG process itself to help improve it? Like the two things that they mentioned, hallucinating, could be fixed by doing different things. There's one of them which is extremely important, is the query rewrite. So if you have a query rewriter hooked up to a fast LLM, let's say a Turbo, giving it context of the conversation, it can rewrite the user's question before doing cosine similarity research on the vector database to get better results. Or re-ranking, because you obviously got to do some re-ranking. There's high techniques as well. Can you get under the hood to do that stuff?
Yeah, definitely. And that's some of the pressure that I'm talking about. So one, we are doing like re-ranking of things, right? We're doing that within our current deployment. We're not doing query rewrites right now. We're exploring that with text to SQL, right? Write a query and giving it schema and things like that. Those are great things. You can cache responses as well, or cache queries as well. I know commonly held ones, and then do a lookup as opposed to just trying to rewrite it from scratch. So see if it looks like one of these other ones that people have asked in the past, and if that's something. So it's definitely, I think, up to what you want to do, what you want to spend time on and resources on. So those examples that I provided were kind of just initial forays into it. We haven't seen a lot of demand. Our marketing team has not said that they get like really bad results. So that's not something then that we're spending time on and see as a top priority, because it's good enough, right? It's comparing it to the baseline of what they have and the process that they have that exists right now. And this is just doing a lot better job. So yeah, it's on the list, but it's not on the top of the list because it's not that much of a problem for us.
What about the ability to modify the metadata that's actually stored in the embedding before it gets to the vector database? That way you can do more of a hybrid search, like you said, I got the wrong documents. If you in the metadata, if you had the document name, the year, authors, and additional information, you could use the metadata to actually get to the documents you want instead of having them bleed and get mixed results.
I could see that in terms of, again, I don't know how much authors would make sense if you have like a trusted author list or something like that, or like a recognized expert list. Then you could modify your search score to put those at the top. You could certainly do like a recency bias and just assume that more recent documents should get a higher score than others.
Yeah,
So,
and not necessarily talking about just the author, but let's just say this document is about movies. This document's about this. Using the metadata to say I'm specifically talking about movies, it's going to ignore the rest of it. It's not even going to include that in the vector search.
right, yeah, so using tags and combining that hybrid search, the keyword search with semantic search.
Yeah, I mean, basically that's what I was going to say, because if you look at a lot of the research that's coming out more recently, there is this idea of multiple retrieval techniques, and I think that a lot of us get confused between what the LLM is doing versus what happens during the retrieval process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, for instance, with the same query, right, I've seen research that says that if you take a question and you ask the LLM for some starting answers, that you can now embed those answers and you may get better responses. There's other techniques where you may take documents and you may relate them in a graph structure. So
Yep.
that when you find similar document, you can get things or chunks that are similar. Some people, even though they use semantic search, will still use keyword search because some of the semantic search, will overlook some things that you would get through keyword search. And then there's this idea of text to SQL, which is better for more analytic types of things, or more things that are actually in the structured format. And you start to see frameworks like agentic RAG and modular RAG that have these combination of these things where you actually do this scatter search all at once, and you start to either rank or even coordinate some of it. So, for instance, if I have a lot of stuff that's in an enterprise system and I want to use text to SQL to get that factual information out, I can then take that information in concert with a semantic search, and maybe I'll get some explanations around some of the things that come back. And so I think a lot of it is just understanding what you get based on the retrieval technique that you leverage, right? Semantic search is just semantic search. If you want to end up getting some type of aggregation from it, good luck, because the completion, the risk of you getting a complete retrieval for that is very low. In certain instances like that, you want to do like a text to SQL against a database because SQL gives you more completion.
Yeah, and that's kind of exactly what I was talking about, right? In this last one, you can SQL database for project description, sure, but then text to SQL, you want to do analytics. And then it's like, well, so yeah, and then putting it all in an agentic framework, absolutely, yeah. I agree with basically everything that you said, sure. And in GraphRag, certainly, like I know that came up earlier in another talk too, that's high on the list, that's the question again, where do we want to devote our resources? You're creating like a knowledge, and it's an interesting thing to do, but then it's more work and it's new territory, right? This knowledge graph for us right now. And then maintaining that, yeah. Yeah, like what we've talked about. So if you have these separate data sources, you've got SQL data, that's very technical. That's got a project number associated with it. And then you've got that marketing data. There's no connection there, right? You may be talking about some of those projects in that marketing, those text documents, but the only way it knows it now is to look at those semantic similarities, right? But it would be great to be able to tie back in the metadata or another knowledge graph in a knowledge graph fashion. Like here are the stories, here are the textual documents, the narratives that tie back, in this many-to-many relationship that we have between these two disparate data sources and build that out.